I watched one of your videos on financial management and how kind of flipping the model on that, and that was taking that back, that control. Could you kind of speak to that at a higher level, I guess is probably...
Yeah, I mean, it's what we're saying there is that profit is intentional, right? Okay. The traditional way of profit is, this is how much income we have, this is how much expenses we're going to need. Profit's what falls out the bottom, right?
Yep.
And I say, that's not terribly sexy, right?
No.
So what you want is the other way around is be a bit more like a corporate, okay? And that is, once you figure out what your income is and determine your profit, and what's left over is going to cover your expenses. And then instead of using your tax categories to prioritise your expenses, we focus on three lots. We want to focus on the expenses that are going to generate additional wealth. That's additional wealth. Okay, so that's more income or more pleasure in what you're doing or fun or that kind of thing, right? Or biodiversity or whatever, okay? That wealth stuff, okay? Secondly is to identify the expenses that you have no negotiation rights over, okay? So, because they're fixed expenses, you have to pay them anyway. And that they might be legal things like rates, or they might even be moral things, like young fellow like you's got some money off your grandma to buy a car.
Yep.
Well, you make sure that she's first on the list when it comes to paying things off with your next paycheck, right? That kind of thing, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And then everything else is what's known as the maintaining expenses. They're essential for the business, but they don't grow additional income. And what we're looking for is opportunities within those expenses to shift money further up the ladder, particularly either into your cash, either your profit or your cash surplus, or into those wealth-generating expenses, and finding that within the business, okay? And so that means that you don't have to go to the bank to grow your business, okay? And you might use, examples of around, different categories to get more emotional equity into your planning. Might be categories like toys and development, for example. Okay, that might be a category that you set a certain amount aside to that might be your wealth generating category, for example. That's what you might call it. Or another category might be instead of fertilizer, you might call it fertilizing. So it's anything to do with the shift of fertility on your property. So it might include the purchase of fertilizer, but it might also include the labour and time that you need to, say, use your livestock to shift fertility around your pasture, or to use bale grazing, for example, okay, and do that instead. So, because all those things are about bringing fertility onto your property, right? Yep. So that's about fertilising, okay? That's what in the first story in my book there, by a guy called Rick Cameron, right? One of the first things he talks about is, how do you change those categories to get more emotional equity in his financial planning. So I think that's missing in a lot of stuff.
Yeah, and I think doing it that way would be kind of more rewarding because you know what you're working towards. You've set out some goals around it, whereas you're not worrying about, geez, I don't know how much is going to fall out the bottom this year.
That's it.
And then that decides how much fun or what development I can do going forward.
That's it. Now be mindful about that. When you identify how much profit you're going to get, doesn't necessarily mean
Guaranteed.
You're going to get it.
No.
Okay? But what it does is it creates that sense of intent. This is what I want. How can I work as hard as I can to make that happen to the best of my ability?
Yeah, and that informs your decisions on the day-to-day, doesn't it?
That's it.
That's a cool way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
You've just spoke briefly about fertilising, and everyone knows how to use a fertiliser truck, but moving it around with livestock, what's been your experience or some of the cool things you've seen with some of the farmers that you've worked with?
I think one of the interesting things is that I think we've lost our premiership in the globe regarding grazing management, right?
Yeah.
And I think that came up last year in the Brougham lecture, where I think it's Dr. Dave Chapman from Ag Research pointed out that all the productivity gains in the dairy industry over the last 40 years have been solely due to nitrogen. And he talks about suboptimal grazing. Now, this is an industry that for 40 years has been telling farmers to graze at the 3-leaf stage, and nobody does it. Okay,
exactly.
The industry has farmers panicking so much about quality. They're always grazing at the 2 or the 2.5-leaf stage, which perpetuates the need for regrassing within 4 or 5 years.
Exactly.
This kind of thing, right? So that's what's largely missing, and so again we can use grazing management. So if we get on top of grazing management, then you can get on top of pasture renovation. Okay, if you get that right. Okay. The other things you can do is you can use livestock to shift fertility around your property. And I talk about this in my book too. There was a property I visited, and it was one of these places that, had irrigation, fancy, all the fancy gear around fencing, fancy new pastures, lots of fertilizer, overseas contracts, primo, okay?
Yeah.
And we're driving along on the dry island side of the property, and the guy pulls up and goes, "You won't believe this." He said, "I put my ewes on here 5-6 years ago, okay, on this postage stamp, and I can still see the difference 5-6 years later, right?" And I'm going, "Fantastic, have you done it since?" And he goes, "No." I said, "Have you done it anywhere else since?" And he goes, "No." And he was talking about how the Lincoln scientists had suggested he do this. And I said, you realise, I said, that what if you'd done this for, 150 nights, 200 nights a year for the last 5-6 years? You'd have 1,000 to 1,200 times this area looking like this.
Yeah.
Okay, because there was an obvious difference.
Yeah.
It was 6 years they'd been doing it, right? Had done it, right? And I said, if you'd done that, it hasn't cost you a bank loan, a resource consent, an engineer's report. You haven't had to subscribe to electrical and plumbing services.
Yeah.
Okay? And all it's cost you is an overhead, the shepherd's wage.
Yeah.
I said, "Which you're going to pay for anyway." I said, "You name another business that wouldn't give its left testicle to grow inventory, okay, pasture,
Yeah.
okay, with an overhead."
Exactly.
Okay? This is the unfair advantage of farming. And this goes right back to the 40s when there was a guy running around called Peter Sears. He was an agroecologist.
Mm-hmm.
And he talked about night and day grazing. And this is how they were using animals to lift the fertility across properties. Was that when you put the animals in a smaller enclosure at night, they concentrate their dung urine, because the first thing they do when they get up in the morning is like everybody else, right? They go and have a crap and a good look round.
Yeah.
And so that puts the fertility right where you park them overnight. And then you give them the rest of the paddock for the day. And that's how you shift fertility around. And all it costs you is the shepherd's wage, and a bit of meat for his dog,
Exactly.
or her dog, right? That kind of thing, right? So we've lost those principles. That's what's missing today. I mean, if farmers did more of that, then they wouldn't need to have so much fertilizer.
Yeah.
Because the problem with fertility on the farm isn't that you haven't got enough, is that it's shifting from the middle of the paddock to the shelter belt, to the trough, to the gateway, to the high point, to the campsite, to the hay rack. That's where it's the salt block rack. Okay, that's where the fertility is shifting to. But if you've got your stock density, then the animals can't all park on one space. So that fertility moves out to the middle of the paddock, or particularly on the side of a hill. The old girls won't like it that you park them up there overnight, but that's what you got to do to get your fertility up, because that's what lifts the fertility up across the whole property. Absolutely. And the guys that are running 10,000 or more stock units in one mob, they all talk the same thing. They all say, my grandfather's running 30 or 40 mobs, and we end up with all the fertility in different parts of the paddock. But by doing this, we even the fertility right across the whole paddock without any subdivision. Mm. If we're all sheep, we don't need to fence off the waterway, so it's all natural water. So there's no water system that you've got to invest in. Yeah. Okay. And you've got to remind farmers that 80% of the nitrogen that the animal uses goes through it, 100% of the potassium, and probably 80 to 90% of the sulfur and the phosphate go through the animal. It comes out the other end, Talking to a guy, and he had a mob of well over 10,000 sheep, and we calculated that his animals were squeezing out on 2022 prices, so right at the top end, right?
Yeah.
About 4.5 grams worth of nutrients a day.
Jeez.
That was 1.6 million a year. Okay, so, compared to his fertiliser bill, it just dwarfed it, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
and he doesn't tell you that. You won't get that from a fertiliser executive or a grep, you know what I mean? They don't tell you about that stuff. They don't show, if they're quoting kilograms of dry matter per hectare for their, or cents for the fertiliser that you're paying for, they won't deduct the amount that clover contributes to that, or the bacteria, or whatever else. Earthworm slime currently is 45% nitrogen. Who want to pay for urea, So, that's the thing, is that they don't deduct all that stuff. They expect that all that grass that you're going to grow is going to be due to the fertiliser, when in fact, it might only be the last 25%. So, no one talks about that, No one talks about that.